Let's talk about the year 1999. I was a young, impressionable middle schooler, toting my Bible around, and my best friend at the time was another little Bible thumper. So at our public school, we brought our Bibles to lunch, and we read this passage under the cafeteria tables. We were, at the time, pretty concerned about the coming of the end of the world. After all, there were hurricanes and earthquakes in the news that seemed like these signs in the sun, moon, and stars. There was certainly distress among the nations. Bill Clinton had just ordered airstrikes on Iraq. And it was 1999. The Y2K disaster was looming over us. For those who may not remember, this prediction that the world's computers would all go haywire as the dates changed from 1999 to 2000, sending governments and stock markets and the whole world into confusion. So, fearing the end, my friend and I read our Bibles and talked about how to be prepared. We were not the only ones who have noticed how easy it is to apply Jesus' words here to our modern world. There have been enough natural disasters of late for some to wonder if these might be these signs in the sun, moon, and stars. There is confusion about the seas and the roaring waves, certainly. Think of flooding, hurricanes, rising seas. Just this weekend, a tsunami in Alaska. And there's distress among the nations, war, tension, fear, distrust. So, according to Wikipedia, since 2000 alone, there have been 22 high-profile predictions of the end of the world. In case you're curious, the next one you might want to have on your radar is June 9th, 2019. This prediction comes from Ronald Wineland, a cult leader who has previously predicted the end of the world in 2011, 2012, and 2013. He was then in jail for tax evasion from 2013 to 2016. But now he's out, so I guess he's getting back into the apocalypse game. Of course, aside from the dabblings of middle school Bible thumpers like myself, most of these predictions come from the fringes. And we in the mainstream recognize them as a little extreme, a little out of touch with reality. They're a poor interpretation of Jesus' words. But then, what is a good interpretation of Jesus' words here? How is Jesus any different than Ronald Wineland? I sense that most of the time, most of us would rather ignore this passage altogether. Even though it appears in 3 of the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, most of us find it a little too weird to spend much time thinking about, especially not in Advent. I mean, isn't this supposed to be a time of joy, a time where we ring bells and look at pictures of angels and wrap gifts and dress up children in fuzzy sheep costumes for pageants? I think we expect this time to be getting ready for a cute little baby Jesus who comes so that we can drink cocoa and feel warm inside. And we can't quite wrap our minds around a Jesus who rides on a cloud with great power and glory, a Son of Man whose coming might catch us like a trap. But listen again to the last words from this passage. After Jesus has been proclaiming the end of the world, Luke tells us this. Each day Jesus was teaching at the temple, and all the people came early in the morning to hear him. Early in the morning? For signs of fear and foreboding and an end? No thanks, Jesus. So why did they come? What was so compelling about his words? I think it helps to remember that these people coming to the temple so early were the people of Israel, a people who had been under foreign rule for hundreds of years, first by Babylon, then the Persians and the Greeks. They were now under the Roman Empire. They had seen years of oppression. They had given so much of their money, their crops, their livelihoods to Caesar. And perhaps they longed not just for little changes, but for a cataclysmic shift that would finally set them free to rule themselves or to live in peace. So when they heard about this Son of Man who would come in great power and confront the powers of the world and throw everything off balance, perhaps their hearts quickened. They woke up early thinking about it. They rushed to the temple to hear more. Most of us, of course, are not quite in that same situation. We are not, at least in the same way, oppressed. And if we're honest, most of us are more aligned with the Romans than the Jews from that time. But when it comes down to it, when we're willing to sit and think about the darknesses in our lives and in our world, I imagine that many of us could stand a cataclysmic change. As much as we're grateful that God sent baby Jesus to earth 2,000 years ago, there is still too much left unfixed by that first advent. Christ brought us hope of a new life. Christ brought us hope of redemption, hope of a new way of justice and peace. But we've yet to see it fulfilled. Year after year, Christmas comes and goes. The cheeriness of the season wears off, and we're left in the same situation as before. Grieving those we've lost, or yearning for a child or a job or a relationship that we don't have. We're tired of the powers of this world dictating who can be accepted and who must be rejected, who has enough to eat and who doesn't, who can live in peace with their family, and who has to face challenge after challenge, war, violence, and other difficulties. So when I think about it this way, I start to long for a different kind of Advent, where this confrontational Son of Man will come in power and throw the world off balance in order to remake it in justice and love. Of course, it's really the same Advent. That baby Jesus years ago threw the world off balance just the same as this powerful Son of Man. And this great shift is what we are preparing for at Christmas. And even though I'm no longer a 7th grader expecting the apocalypse in my lifetime, I long for this Son of Man to break into the world in little ways, in big ways, each and every day, shifting the powers more and more into God's design. But even as I long for it, even as you may long for it too, even as the people in Jesus' day longed for it, we're not quite ready for this Jesus. We're not quite ready for Jesus to confront our world in judgment because we are entangled with the status quo. We are entangled with the powers that Jesus is coming to confront. And Jesus says the judgment will come not only on the people we can easily classify as evil, but on all who live on the face of this whole earth. As the Son of Man comes in power and great glory, causing distress among the nations, parts of our lives will be shaken too. The truth is that as much as I want to see an end to the world's systems of division, greed, inequality, I also benefit from them. My own well-being is entangled in a world where some are more privileged than others, and I, like the Roman citizens in Jesus' time, have benefited from the education and privileges and benefits that others have been denied. Phew, okay, this is heavy stuff, so let me just pause for a moment to say, I'm pretty sure it is not advisable to talk about apocalypse or confrontation in one's first sermon in a new place. But this was the gospel that the lectionary assigned for today. I did not choose it. And Jesus' words here have confronted me, so I share that with you as a fellow pilgrim. And of course, regardless of our privilege or power or complicity, we can be confident that the Lord is merciful. Hear that good news this morning. But given our entanglement with unfair systems, it's no wonder that the idea of this Christ who confronts makes us a little bit uncomfortable. We are not quite ready to see these systems topple. The good news is that Advent is a time to prepare, and Jesus, in today's text, doesn't just leave us in our not quite ready state. He tells us how to get ready. Be on guard, Jesus says, so that your hearts are not weighed down with dissipation and drunkenness and the worries of this life. In other words, don't get distracted. It's easy to get distracted in Advent. The flashing lights, the long to-do lists, the hurried events are supposed to help us get in the spirit of the season, but sometimes I think they can distract us from preparing for Christ. I mean, the very things we do at Christmas time sometimes are part of this status quo system that Jesus wants to shake up. We put more coins into the coffers of the rich. We gather joyfully with friends and family who make us comfortable while sometimes forgetting to look for the stranger who needs welcome. And sometimes I think we like to be distracted. After all, every moment we are designing Christmas cards, baking dozens of cookies, and clicking away on Amazon for gifts is a moment we don't have to think about broken relationships, separated families, poverty, violence, and hate. The busyness of Advent distracts us from despair also. But Jesus says, be on guard. Instead of distracting ourselves, we are called to be alert at all times. Be alert for the parts of our lives and our hearts that are tied to the status quo. Be alert to the powers. Let me give an example. Because this past week, I've become more alert to one aspect of the way our powerful nation disrupts those who it determines don't belong. I recently moved here from Durham, North Carolina, and for the past week, I've been watching tearfully as some of my friends in Durham have been sharing news about a friend of theirs named Samuel. He's a pastor who is from Mexico, but has lived in North Carolina legally for 20 years. His wife, Yulia, has severe lupus, and she has lawful status to receive medical treatment here in the U.S. And his son is also a U.S. citizen who has lived in North Carolina his entire life. Now, last year, Samuel reported for his annual renewal of status and was notified that his papers were not going to be renewed. So rather than be separated from his family, he entered sanctuary in a church where some of my friends attend, living in the church basement and staying inside to be protected from the authorities. He helped out around the church with construction. He played music and worship. But last week, he left the church grounds for an appointment. He was appealing his immigration status, trying to get legal documentation again. And he was told to come in for fingerprinting. While he was at the office, he was arrested, and a few days later, he was deported back to Mexico. Despite the peaceful protest of his church members who surrounded the police van singing Amazing Grace and We Shall Not Be Moved for hours and pleading for their brother in Christ. Now, our immigration system is complicated, and I'm not here to argue the fine points of policy, but I do know this. When the Son of Man comes, there will be no divisions, no economic scarcity, no fear of outsiders. All these things will be dissolved. These are the powers that will be shaken, and in fact, the Son of Man is already confronting these powers. I see Jesus in the way Samuel's church community sang of God's grace without fear, and in the way they offered communion and broke bread together not only with Samuel's family, but also with the officers at the jail, breaking down divisions. So Jesus is confronting the powers of the world already, and you and I are called to be alert. What can we do about such systems, though? There are powers and policies and reasonings that took Samuel away from his family, and they're complicated. And there are so many huge problems in the world like this that feel overwhelming. So frankly, I'd rather concern myself with Christmas parties and shopping lists, the distractions and worries of this life, than try to figure out how to untangle these powers of inequality and division. Be alert, Jesus says, and pray for strength. So as we step into Advent without answers, I'm going to suggest one concrete step for all of us. That is to try and step back from one or two distractions, whether events or tasks or worries, And in that extra moment of silence this Advent, let's pause and ask Jesus for the strength, not to figure it all out, but perhaps to find one thread we can untangle. One stranger we can embrace in a system that asks us to divide. One word we can speak for love and against fear. One way to redirect our money and power out of systems and companies that profit from division. One way to be Christ's church in a time of distress. And then when it all seems too overwhelming, when it all seems like too much to handle, too uncomfortable to face, take heart. The Christ child is coming soon. The Son of Man is coming soon. Our redemption from this broken, divided, unjust world is drawing near. Amen.